Alright, welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker, and here we are about to do a classical era tier list for Humankind. I know it's been a while since we've done any Humankind content, but somebody asked me about it, and I love this game. It's a lot of fun, and so we'll definitely do some more tier lists if folks want to see them. But we're about to enter into the classical era, so let's talk very briefly about what I feel is a generally strong and consistent playstyle in the ancient era. So here in the ancient era, this is really one of these influence constrained starts out of us. We didn't have a source of mammoths nearby. We actually only got like 1 or 2 mammoth fights before having to switch into the ancient era. We were running out of good cultures to pick from. But there is a very strong pressure towards influence in the ancient era, because influence is the thing that's going to restrict your ability to grow your civ wide, and growing wide is super duper duper good at the beginning of the game. But of course, one way you can save on influence is just taking cities from people. And so anybody who has any sort of military bonus in the ancient era, which Harappans absolutely do not think that runners are not useful in combat, because that's how we took their capital so early. We just had a whole bunch of nomadic scouts flipped over to Harappans and then took their capital. The Nubians have 1 population and we have 14 in our capital, so I wonder how this continent is going to resolve itself. But that sort of highlights a very important thing. If you don't get access to an estate star in the ancient era, 2 things need to happen. 1, you need to take a city from somebody, otherwise you're not going to have enough influence in order to grow wide. And 2, you need to make a very specific and concerted effort to get to the classical era as soon as possible, so that way you can ensure an estate star for yourself. The estate star abilities are really, really strong in the classical era. You get way more culture because you are a classical era culture rather than an ancient era culture. And so even if you start as an estate, you definitely want to flip into one of the estates in the classical era as soon as you can. But if you can't, because other people take them, what do? That's sort of what this tier list is about. How to interpret how you should play the classical era through. Ultimately, I think the gameplay in the classical era is going to be pretty similar to the ancient era. One of the easiest ways to save on influence when it comes to turning outposts into cities is to just take cities from people. And so lean into that, beat people up and take their things. But if you have any other ways to generate influence on a culture, or ways to cheat on influence on a culture, that's really, really good. Now, important to note, this is not yet the medieval period, and so we won't have access to the money ability to buy an outpost, but that is something that you gain access to in the medieval period, and so at that point I think money goes up a lot. But let's begin by talking about the Achaemenid Persians. So I'm just going to talk about this once. I think that generally speaking, don't overestimate the value of whatever fame generation you get here, because that's not how you should approach the ancient or classical or medieval periods, honestly. Just push through those as quickly as you can. Don't think too hard about what's going to get you the most fame in those periods of time, because the further ahead you get, the more of these extra unique traits you get, the more unique buildings and unique units you get, the more you'll get ahead of whoever is trying to build up way too much fame. Just make progress, because if somebody has more fame than you, but they're your vassal because you beat them up in a war, you still win. So, the Achaemenid Persians. Achaemenid Persians, expansionist. That's not a useful ability, I don't think. Unless you manage to get tons and tons of money in the ancient era, you're never going to use this. Cyrus's Shadow, don't overestimate the value of city cap. You can always go over city cap. The first city over city cap costs 10 influence, and then the next one costs 100. It's really not until you're 3 over that it starts costing a lot. It costs 1,000 at that point. But what that should highlight for you is that A, we can get another city cap out of our laws by switching into small council, and then B, you should have an economy by the classical era that can definitely support 1 over city cap and ideally 2 over city cap. And so when you look at Cyrus's Shadow, you have to ask yourself, are you going to have access to 6 cities in the classical era? If you're gonna have access to 6 cities because you know you're gonna beat somebody down in a war, then Cyrus's Shadow goes way up. It's a really strong ability if you're sure you're gonna have 6 cities in classical. But 6 cities is a lot, and so you need to take them from people. There's no way you're gonna get enough influence on your own. And so what that means is Achaemenid Persians, this is a stronger ability if you already have a military start. So if you manage to go into Mycenaeans, for instance, they have access to a strong garrison that gives you another way to spawn units on the board, and therefore sort of makes those units, air quotes, faster, right? Like if we had a way to spawn units right here, then we could immediately send them in to attack that city instead of walking them all the way over here. And so If you start with a strong militarist start, I think Achaemenids are a lot stronger. If you manage to get a lot of influence in the ancient era, then you might get up to 5, and then that's okay. But I think it does scale relatively well into the mid to late game. And it's important to note that stability is actually a source of influence for you. Stability comes from pops living in happy cities, in addition to all your other abilities and stuff. And so if we were to improve our stability here in our giant capital, then it would benefit us actually in regards to our influence generation. Satrap's Palace is nice. It's a bunch of influence per adjacent district, and so if you manage to pick up the pyramids or the Egyptians in the ancient era, then that Satrap's Palace ability goes up. But I think that generally speaking, money isn't as strong in the classical era. It's still good because it is a source of influence, but don't go crazy about it. The Immortals are another source of influence in a sense because they cost 1 bronze and have 28 strength. These things just absolutely dumpster units. If you want to beat people up, then playing the Achaemenids is actually pretty fun. The biggest problem with them, of course, is that they have 4 movement. Jesus Christ, they have 28 strength. Like, if you've never fought anybody with Immortals in the classical era, you should. It's fun. You destroy people very easily. I think that overall combination for Achaemenids actually puts them in the A tier for me. I think you do need to be aggressive in order to get good value out of the Achaemenids, and so if you don't like fighting people, then maybe don't play them. But if you are a person who's just looking to play Humankind to win, then I think that the Achaemenid Persians are in a pretty good place. They have an outrageously strong unit, which really puts it over the threshold for me. But their basic ability isn't bad. All right, let's talk about the Aksumites. So the Aksumites have access to the merchant ability. The merchant ability is ultimately fine. I think the biggest strength of the merchant ability is the mediation ability, but that's only really strong if you have a lot of trade partners. And so you have to assess how much trade you have currently going on. If you have a lot of neighbors because you're playing on Pangaea and you did a lot of scouting and everybody wants to trade with you and everyone's your friend, then mediation can make you an outrageous fortune. But you kind of need like 3 other trade partners in order for this to be good. And so scale that in. Right? If you're playing on a continent where you only have 1 neighbor who you're going to bully to death, then the merchant ability kind of does nothing. In the later eras, then merchant ability can do a lot more because money can do a lot more, but here at the beginning of the game, money is mostly just there. You can use it to rush out buildings and trade with people, and that's about it. On the same note, their unique trait, Horn of Plenty, +2 money on tile producing money. This doesn't do a ton. +2 money on tile producing money in this state would probably be like +20 money per turn. That's not worth even considering. And because it's a flat bonus and not a percentage thing, it's really not that good. Now, fortunately, I think the Great Obelisk is actually pretty strong, because I think Faith is actually pretty strong. So, Great Obelisk, it's +1 money per territory under the religion's influence. That means that this pays you off a lot for pushing a strong faith. And then, broadly speaking, faith, the reason that I like it, the reason that I think it's good, is that it's flexible. It's one of the things that you have non-RNG control over when it comes to your start and the resources that you develop. And so I think underestimating the strength of faith is really bad. Faith can do a lot when it comes to fixing up a bad start, or even just giving you a stronger start, right? It lets you specialize either in the things that you're weak in, or in the things you're already strong in. And so anything that generates faith, it's not as good as anything that generates influence, but I think that faith is probably the second strongest resource at game start. And so I think the Great Obelisk is across the board just good. The Shodalai are bananas though. These are another one of these, like, if you really want to fight people and you want to make it feel really, really lopsided, go with these guys. They have a larger zone of control, which cannot be ignored. This means that you're going to be able to just absolutely demolish some of your enemy's units with just defending. And so the Shodalai, I think that you do need to be pretty aggressive when it comes to utilizing these units. So this is another one where, like, if you get boxed out of everything and you just want to fight people, at least their unique unit is simultaneously good and interesting. But I do think that the combination of all of the other things in the package being mediocre at best means I really can't give the Aksumites anything higher than a C. All right, let's talk about the Carthaginians. So the Carthaginians, we already talked about the merchant ability, but these guys have a way, way better unique trait, minus 25% on all constructible buyout costs is outrageous. If you can do buyout constructible stacking, you can get some really, really, really good use out of money. And so if you're going to be trying to lean into a money strategy later on in the game, which absolutely is a way to break free from being so reliant on influence, that you actually probably want to pick up Carthaginians. And of course, they have a pretty strong, unique building here. This is a harbor that exploits every resource, and it gives you a giant bonus for industry per adjacent lake or coastal water. Industry is very, very strong, and this counts as a bunch of different types of quarters. And so the Kothon, I think an across the board, very strong package. Obviously, this gets a lot stronger when there's a lot of water. And so if you're playing on a Pangea 90% land, then you probably can't play Carthaginians. But if you're playing on a continental map and there's a whole lot of water around, then the Kothons are actually really strong. And of course, you have access to war elephants with 30 strength and trample, which gives you stronger when attacking weaker units, damaged units. You can absolutely demolish stuff with war elephants. They are terrifying to fight on the battlefield, as described here, but they do have cavalry problems, and so you gotta bring along siege weapons if you're gonna try to use these to attack into cities. But that's okay. Like, in the classical era, you should have access to siege weapons if you want them. And so how do we rate the Carthaginians? I really like this trait, especially if you're trying to lean into using money in the medieval era, but I think the Kothon is highly variable because it really does depend on having access to water. And although the war elephants are very powerful, they're also insanely expensive. So I think all of those things together makes me think that the Carthaginians are around a B. I think that the Carthaginians are a lot stronger, maybe even an A-tier faction, if there's a ton of water near you, or if you have a very specific plan to lean into money, at which point the Carthaginians are probably the number one faction in the game. If you're playing on a higher water map, then they're probably an A tier, but I think on an average map, they're probably a high B. The Celts, unlike the Harappans, are not nearly as powerful or oppressive, I don't think, because hopefully by the time you get to the classical era, either you were the Harappans, in which case you have access to infinite food, or you were influence, in which case you have access to infinite food, or you conquered all of your neighbors and took all of their capitals, in which case you should have access to infinite food. So I think the Celts, unfortunately, are sort of like one step too late, not to mention the fact that, generally speaking, I think something that scales off of farmers rather than exploited territory is generally worse. But they do have a faith ability. Anytime there's a faith ability on a building, I think that's good. I think that's something that people should lean more into. It lets you fix problems up pretty well. Now, the Gesati here, their unique unit, actually is in a very interesting place. These guys have this fervor ability, no combat strength penalty from damage. And so what that should mean is that if you have any sort of combat bonus from the ancient era that you're carrying over into the classical era, the Gesati are actually going to use that pretty well. Anything that increases their combat strength or their ability to attack enemy units or even movement speed is going to be really useful. But because their unit stats are so low, remember this is 26 strength versus the 28 strength of the Immortals or the 30 strength of the war elephants, you're going to be relying on just a massed number of them. And while that can be powerful, I don't want to recommend that sort of line of play unless you have a reliable bonus you're bringing with you from the ancient era. That said, food's still good. Anything that gets you food is going to be good. +3 food per number of attached territories is fine, because food gives you pops, and pops should be giving you influence. I think I'd put the Celts as C for Celts. They're just one era too late. The Garamantes are another agrarian civ, but unlike the Celts, we do have here an ability that gets you +5 influence on main plaza, so that hopefully is going to be +10 or +15 influence per turn if you have a bunch of cities, maybe +20. That's not bad, but unfortunately for us, we have a really weird unique building here. This one is very specific and requires sterile terrain near it in order for it to be really useful for you. I think that the Garamantes are sort of like the flip side of the Carthaginians. If you know that you're going to be generating a map where you're going to have tons and tons of sterile terrain, then Garamantes is going to be marginally better. But generally speaking, you're not going to be wanting to be building food and specifically farmers' quarters near sterile terrain anyway. And so this is sort of like, it's in a weird place. I think it's good if you have tons of desert and mountains, but at that point, what are you doing to yourself? You are crazy. Stop doing that. But javelin riders are absolutely sick, right? These are ranged horse units, so you don't need to worry about, oh, what do you do if you attack a city? Well, you just use your javelins and kill people. And anything that's move after attack is also insane. It's only one tile, but this is still a really disgusting ability. Obviously, like with any other good unique unit, in this case, if you're gonna be taking the Garamantes, use your javelin riders. You need to make good use of these units in order for this civ to be worth taking at all. I think I'm gonna put them in as a D tier simply because I don't think that you should be building farmers' quarters in sterile terrain unless there's something very weird going on. But if you're playing on an all desert map or something like that, then obviously these become a lot better. The minor amount of influence that they generate from their unique trait might push them up into C, but I don't think they can be any higher than this. All right, we got the Goths next. So the first thing that I like about the Goths is that they have access to this vigilance ability. You don't have to worry about diplomacy when you're attacking people. You can just attack them. And then when you win, you get tons extra gold because you have tons extra war support lying around. And so this is actually a very, very strong ability, even though it doesn't necessarily give you like +1 strength the way people might normally think about a militarist. Iron reserves is like fine, but I think ultimately you shouldn't be drafting militia. I think you should be building good units, but the +30 war support is pretty real. Nimble pillage is sort of weird. Ransacking is generally speaking not as good as just conquering people. +2 influence on garrison is okay if you were playing Mycenaeans in the ancient era and spammed a whole lot of your Cyclopean fortresses, but it's a very minor amount of influence. Now, fortunately, their unique building is pretty good. +3 influence, +3 faith, +2 faith per adjacent district, and +5 ransack gains on army means that if you build enough of these, then ransacking starts looking a little better. But I think the more important thing here on the Tumulus, of course, is the combination of influence and faith, which I think here, even in the classical era, are the most important resources, because they can turn into everything else. Now, one thing that's unfortunate here about the Gothic cavalry is how outrageously expensive they are. They're 2 horses and 1 iron, and they're a heavy cavalry unit, which means they can't get into cities, and they're 29 strength, which means that they can't just bully people as easily as the war elephants. So I think unfortunately the Gothic cavalry, for a nation that really wants to be doing a whole lot of attacking, I don't think they're very good. And so I think unfortunately the Goths package, it's pulled in too many different directions, and it doesn't do any of the things that it's trying to do well enough for me to recommend them. I think these guys do actually deserve a D tier. The tiny amount of influence they get is just not enough to really worth worrying about. Up next we have the Greeks. The Greeks are okay because they have access to the Collective Minds ability. If you need to rush a very particular technology as quickly as possible, then the Greeks are pretty good. +1 era available to research means that you can actually go ahead and skip ahead a technology level and research plantations in the classical era, which is really good for your economy. And so the Greeks deserve points just for that alone. Socratic methods here, +2 science per researcher on city or outpost is fine, I guess, but you have to have tons and tons of pops for you to want to be running lots of scientists. And so generally speaking, don't overestimate how much extra science you're going to get here. You'll get some, but you'll get way more science generally speaking just utilizing collective minds when you're ready. The amphitheatron is ultimately fine. It's a research quarter, which is pretty good. It does afford you a tiny amount of influence per era, as well as a tiny amount of science per era. But these are pretty basic. These are very small bonuses that you get access to, and they don't do resource exploitation, so I think these are just not very good. Hoplites are dope though. Phalanx granting additional combat strength for each unit with this phalanx ability adjacent to this unit means that if you just get a bunch of hoplites, you can smash people pretty hard, but they are slow melee units, and so if you're going to be using hoplites in the Greeks, then you have a very, very specific play pattern that you kind of need to take into account. A, you're going to want to fight people in the classical era. B, you're going to want access to garrisons on the board to help you spawn hoplite into the field. And then C, you're probably going to want to rush plantations, because you're sacrificing access to going wide in any form other than militaristic conquest, and you don't have access to the militarist star. The Greeks, they are strong, but you do need to play them very, very specifically towards the strengths of being able to research ahead. Otherwise, they just don't do a lot. But I think if you play them well, that the Greeks actually are an A-tier faction, just because getting access to plantations early is outrageous for your city growth. Next, we have the Huns. So the Huns, they're another militarist faction, so you're going to be attacking people, like, big surprise there, they're Huns. But +2 combat strength on cavalry unit is always nice. +5 science on empire per unit that's in hostile territory means that you can get tons of influence, actually, in the classical era by just getting an infinite number of Hunnic hordes and just flooding the zone with them. And the Ordu are going to help you out in that too, because these are going to be making it so your outposts, they really can't do anything for you except spawn more Hunnic hordes. But Hunnic hordes are really disgusting. They're nomad units, and so these guys can actually grow as they fight people, because these are not just nomads that generate food from fighting animals. You're going to generate food from fighting your enemies. And so your Hunnic hordes, if you have access to just a wide open plain of people who you can conquer, are probably one of the top tier factions. The only thing that's really holding them back here in regards to the Hunnic horde is, of course, their very, very low strength. 20 strength means that they are 6 strength lower than an average horseman. But I think in order to make good value out of the Hunnic horde and their nomad strength, you really just need an infinite number of enemies to fight. And so the Hun package basically is built for Pangaea maps. If you're playing on Pangaea and you're playing with like 12 enemy empires on a huge map, then you probably want to play with Huns. But you really do need an infinite number of people to fight for them to be worth taking. I think because their package is very strong when it's set up well, I can't put them in D tier. I think that their ability to grow is pretty unparalleled, but you do need tons of enemies to fight. And so think of this not really as a C tier, but more as like a high B, low A, or just like an F tier, where the more enemies that you have to fight, the better it becomes. All right, up next we have the Mauryans. These guys are the best. They have access to cultural blitz. This is still the best. You get tons of extra influence for being in the classical era rather than the ancient era. So even if you're playing as an ancient era aesthete, doesn't matter. Just ascend or switch into the Mauryans. Don't stay behind in the ancient era. You get way too much influence by being in a higher era. But in addition to just being like normal aesthete, lots of influence, they also get +1 influence on emblematic districts and -10% on attach outpost cost, as well as having a building that gets you +2 influence per adjacent district, which that's something. And of course you get a giant ranged platform war elephant. They're ranged, and so you can't use them necessarily to conquer cities the same way that you would with like Immortals, for instance. But these are amazing, amazing support platforms and really dominate warfare during their time period. I wish I had more to say, but like the Mauryans are just the best. I think that the Mauryans might literally be the single best culture in the entire game because of the strength of being in a classical era and having an aesthete star, as well as all of the other bonuses available to it. If you can ever take Mauryans, you should. They're very, very, very good. Up next we have the Maya. So Maya are pretty strong. They are an industrious civilization with +2 industry per worker on city or outpost, and a fairly important bonus here in terms of their unique building. +4 industry per adjacent maker's quarters means that you can get tons of industry locally, and hey, you get a little bit of faith there. Now the problem sort of with the Maya is their unique unit. They're pretty good in regards to this poison ability, but unfortunately they only have 2 range. And so what that means is they're very complicated to use in combat. They're not necessarily bad, but you need a combination of Javelineers as well as screening units that are going to help pin targets down. And so you need a very particular army makeup in order to make good use of these units. And unfortunately for the Maya, they don't have access to any sort of influence bonus. So while their ability to build really is unparalleled, especially here in the classical era, it's literally unparalleled, I don't think that you should overemphasize the strength of the Maya. I do not think that they are stronger than aesthete stars. And frankly, this is going to drive some of you crazy, but I think that generally speaking, they are weaker than the Greeks. because gaining access to early plantations really is that strong. They're still A tier though, and you should not ever be ashamed to be playing Mayans in the classical era. Now up next we have Nazca. Nazca is an estate star, but that's basically it. You're probably not going to be building their emblematic district that often. It's not that good until it gets lots of other emblematic districts online, and so in order to get good value out of Nazca lines, you do kind of need to have been Egyptian or gotten the pyramids or both in the ancient era to really get good use here. And unfortunately, their unique trait, +1 bonus emblematic district on territories containing a natural wonder, is very weird and circumstantial. Obviously, the more emblematic districts that you can cram into one territory, the more that Nazca lines really powers you up. And so it is good if you have access to like 3 or 4 natural wonders, I guess. But I don't think that this is like strong enough to really focus on anything else here on the page. But because it's so circumstantial, it really does pull the whole culture down. Headhunters are fine, but these guys are another one of these 26 strength standing army units that just kind of get rolled by the stronger units in the classical era. So really, the Nazca ask the biggest question that I think one can ask oneself. Is an estate star alone worth an S? In this case, I actually think no. I think it's important from a communication standpoint that Mauryan stands above everybody else. I do think that, generally speaking, it probably is weaker even than just taking one of the stronger non-estate stars, which kind of breaks the format here. But there is another sort of S tier right here, which is just either of the estate star cultures in the ancient era and just rolling it forward, because you can always do that too. We could transcend as the Harappans. We wouldn't as the Harappans, but you could as the Olmecs pretty easily. Generally speaking, at least with the current AI, you're never going to have competition for the Mauryans if you want them, although there's a very important final culture for us to discuss, the Romans. So again, don't worry too much about the expansionist or the stars or any of that fame stuff. That doesn't matter. Just race ahead in your eras, you'll do much better for yourself. But this is +1 unit slot available for each army and plus 50% experience gain on each unit. This is probably the strongest military bonus in the game, at least available until the Soviets. And so if you are in a position to do a lot of military conquest, then you kind of have to ask yourself, like, are you going to go into Huns and get tons of Hunnic hordes? Or are you going to go into the Romans and beat people down? One advantage that the Hunnic hordes have access to, of course, is that they can bring their hordes back and disband them into their own cities, and therefore use their armies in order to grow their cities in a way that basically nobody else can. But that's not stronger than Praetorian Guards. These guys have 29 strength. They have a Triumphal Arch that's +5 influence, flat +5 influence that you don't have to jump through hoops for, and it gets you extra stability, which in turn can get you extra influence depending on how happy your cities are. And tactical superiority means that Praetorian Guards aren't even really just 29 strength. Like, if you have reasonable sized armies, which you should because of Legion's finest, then Praetorian Guards are gonna just beat the crap out of whoever they're fighting against if they aren't war elephants. But of course, if you're playing the Romans, you're gonna need a couple of things. A, you're gonna need a lot of pops, so that way you can draft them into being Praetorian Guards. B, you're gonna need a lot of industry, because you're gonna need to build a lot of Praetorian Guards. And C, you're gonna need a lot of people near you for you to beat up. I think all that together means that the Romans probably deserve a spot here as an A tier civ. I almost want to put them up here as an S tier civ alongside the Mauryans, but I do think that there is a meaningful enough difference here between the Mauryans and the Romans that it does need to be distributed like this. So what this distribution should highlight to you is that A, I think the right thing to do when it comes to the ancient era is to leave it as soon as possible, because I do think that you really do want to get Mauryans if you can, and if you can't, I really do think you want to get one of these A tier cultures. Now, when it comes to how do you approach the move from ancient to classical, should you delay it? I think across the board, no, but it's important to note that delaying in the Neolithic era is a little stronger simply because of the nature of the game and the nomadic tribes. Now, there's one final culture here that we haven't discussed, and it's because I don't actually own the DLC. So the DLC Together We Rule introduces some diplomacy to the game that I think would be fun to explore at some point, but at the moment I don't have it, and so I don't want to judge the Han. They do have some interesting things here, but you can read them yourself in the encyclopedia, and I don't want to give people the wrong impression when it comes to the diplomatic characters, because these might be good, I don't know. I just don't know how often you're going to be doing leveraging actions, because if you're doing them a lot, then you can get a lot of science out of your paper mills, and the military units look interesting here. And so there's something here with the Han, but I don't think I can judge them. All right, but that's Walker, and that's our classical era tier list here on We Play Games. Take care.